Hi, everybody. I think I might be the speech while you are hungry for lunch, so we'll try and make this appetizing and fun and interesting. And there are some seats in the front if people want to come in. I know that these are tight. In any case, it is so great to be here. Thank you so much. What I wanted to talk to you about is a little bit about how we think about the new relationship between humans and machines. And certainly this last speaker that we had, what a great conversation on bias. So I'm going to start with something just maybe to get the blood flow going here. A little bit of a hand poll, so a non-technical fancy poll. First, raise your hand if you have experience building or using a generative AI product. All right. I would expect 100%. So anyone who didn't raise their hand, they're either not listening because they're on a Gen AI application right now, or maybe they're here to actually start learning. Okay, next question. So related to that, when everybody's hands went up, there were a couple who didn't. In our most recent research, we found that 90% of employees are using generative AI in their work. That's an astounding number. I think there have been few instances where we've seen such a fast proliferation and usage in our work days. Okay, next question. I want to hear what it felt like, not just that you used it. So which of the emojis sort of best describes your experience with generative AI? Super happy, kind of stars, raise your hand, you just loved it. Okay, not everyone's raising their hand. This is a group of technologists, fascinating. Kind of like, quizzical. Okay. And then the last one is, meh, I don't know. I mean, I've seen other things that are more impressive. Okay, thank you. Nobody said that in this. Oh, one person said that. All right, brave to say what she thinks. So in our most recent research, over 90% of generative AI users say that they're having a positive experience with the tools that are being given in their workplace. Again, we are 18, 20 months into this incredible shift in how we work and relate to machines. That's pretty outstanding. Okay, so this just gives you a sense of where we are at a moment in time. The reason it matters and the reason we have 90% of people saying that they are spending time with generative AI in their work and that they're probably having a pretty good experience is that AI has the potential not only to be arguably one of the most interesting technologies, but to actually have a profound effect in moving our productivity frontier. And from a business perspective, where I sit, this is one of the most interesting reasons, which is that we think, based off of looking at a basket of use cases where generative AI has an economic impact, that there is an upward level of $4.4 trillion of economic productivity value. Now that number is so large, it's hard to kind of get your arms around it. So I'll give you a couple of the caveats that you would expect. This is not all this year, next year. This can take a decade, this can take 2 decades. As we think about in our own history, technologies that have reshaped fundamentally our productivity frontier, these are long-term trends. These are trends that are with us and continue innovating, and we continue seeing the adoption over decades. But just to put that into proportion, $4.4 trillion is a lot. It's larger than the size of the GDP of the UK economy today. So the idea that as you're thinking about your companies that you're part of, the idea that you may be able to get incremental inches or miles from using generative AI in your work, that's a really big deal. So in the last year, I think what we've all seen is we've moved from awareness to action very quickly. And if we look at all other types of historical trends, the iPhone, cloud, digital, we didn't really see such an uptake. And so we see all kinds of enterprises announcing boldly, maybe those are pilots, maybe they're actually beginning to scale, but announcing investments. In fact, the vast majority of companies we surveyed recently told us that they had at least 2 functions participating in active pilots in generative AI, thinking about how they reshape work. And we see numbers that are just staggeringly large. So 80 billion is OpenAI's estimated valuation. We see a 400% increase in VC investments. We see, Hallucinate, this is actually one of my favorite trivias of the last year. Hallucinate was named the 2023 Word of the Year by Cambridge Dictionary. Never has that word had so much popularity till it became associated to the most popular technology of 2023. So, and actually quite a serious set of conversations about hallucinations and AI models, which I'm sure we're going to talk about at this conference. But it just shows you how quickly. And I think when we sit here in San Francisco, we're like, yeah, we're just moving at the pace. But when we step back and we look at ways in which technologies has reshaped our lives and our economies, this is a pretty super speed. So there are two things I just wanted to mention, which is this idea of maximizing the productivity frontier. I wanted to share with you how that starts to look at an industry level, and then also how that starts to look at an individual worker level. And so, whether you are developing the technologies and selling them to and offering them and using them to enable businesses, or you're representing the AI division of a business, here's an example from retail. And when I say it changes everything, it truly does. So if I think about a retail function, a retail business, it's got your commercial functions, your operations, your support. Things like merchandising, marketing, huge pieces of the business, store operations, how do you actually manage for the front office and the back office to look exactly the way you want? How do you manage supply chain? Huge issue for retail. And if we think about these are all the things that drive the productivity and value of these companies. And what this chart shows you is that there are so many use cases that can have an impact on every piece of the business. Now, some of these you would expect because we've talked about them a lot. So going from the back on support, of course it can help software engineering. There's not a company that doesn't have software engineers for which this technology can be extremely useful, especially for things like refactoring legacy code, which is actually one of my favorites, to just basic code translation. Those are the things you would expect. But as you move to the other side of this chart, there are things that I maybe hadn't expected a year ago. I hadn't expected such an impact on store operations. So smart in-store navigation, task assistant co-pilots that are being piloted in retail stores, operations assistance for associates, and all of these things are examples of the machines and the humans working together, almost like building a new team. Merchandising. So this just gives you a sense. And the bottom, what it is kind of a rough sizing of the EBITDA impact. So when we look at all these activities, you have to ask yourself the very basic question. If I invested all of this, if I did all of this input, what is the gain? And that's the ultimate business case, which we can't obscure, and the gains are pretty substantial. And from there, you see retail organizations starting to prioritize where they invest, and how they change the accountability models associated to these investments. So another way to look at this also is it changes roles. We know that of the 4.4 trillion I mentioned at the beginning, 75% of that value sits in 4 functional domains: marketing and sales, customer operations, software development, one of our favorites, and product development. So let's take a look at one of those actual jobs. One of those jobs, one of the oldest jobs in the world, is being a sales rep. And what you see here are a couple things. One is, how are we moving from task automation to rethinking the role? How would the fundamental role of a sales rep change? The second thing, which I think is really interesting, is that in order to enable this is not just generative AI. This is generative AI working with traditional analytical AI, as well as other types of levers. But when you put those all together, you can actually transform the role of a sales rep. A very concrete example of that is when you think about improving conversations that sales reps have with their customers. One of the things for years, for the last decade, many of us have been working on is what's the next product to buy, what's the next service to sell. The analytics that help you trigger for a customer rep, what is the very best pitch perfect way to bring the next thing to the customer. And that actually now can be a combination of generative AI and analytical AI solutions. So that is really, really exciting. Maybe a little practical, but that's what moves the economic needle forward. The second, or sort of the next point, is just that when we think about this, we can all get so fascinated in the technology. And I myself spend tons of time, like all of you, reading and learning about the technology itself. As a side note, this past year has been unbelievable. The type of spring release capabilities we saw in context windows, in explainability, in multimodal, it's really, really exciting. But when you step back, you say, why are we doing all of this? We're doing this to actually change how we work and live. And the hardest part about this is probably not going to be the technology, but the people change that accompanies it. And I don't know what that factor is, but my guess is for all of you, your experiences in actually going beyond creating the technology, but applying it, the people change is the hardest. And so what this chart is really just showing is when we think about it, how do we start to think about both the technology and the people journey together? And a couple things are really critical. As the technology innovates and changes right under our feet, we start to change the tech and data layer. That's probably something we're all really comfortable with. But then what we need for the people journey, the understanding and trust. And there's some very practical questions that you have to ask as you're starting to do this. Do you limit the number of people who are using this to a small group in your company? Do you make it widely available? Do you do training? How do you drive trust and understanding of something so new in the people who are expected to use it? Certainly, you might only have 100 people in a pilot user group, but to have the type of economic impact that starts to scratch at the 4.4 trillion, you're going to need a scale amount of use. So if 10,000, 40,000 employees are using it, how do you bring them along on the journey? It's not just a set of leadership discussions. It's not just a set of data investments. It's a much more profound shift. How do you start to drive that usage? So, I mean, we all have it available, but how often are you using it? How are you actually incorporating it into your workflow? And how do you make folks feel that they are actually co-creating the solutions? Ultimately, what a lot of us are looking at are solutions that do augmentation, not replacement of humans. So how do you design that in mind? But also, how do you look forward knowing that that person's job will get refactored? How do you think about the transitions? How do you actually utilize that time in really amazing ways that make them feel rewarded, appreciated, and want to stay in your companies? So that's all of the people journey, or at least a couple of elements of it, that go along with the reinvention of the technology that we use, which is a really important part, and I think just the beginning of the discussions that we're starting to see at the enterprise level. And so what I wanted to do before we open it up for questions is just leave you with more questions as you go back to your offices after this conference, which is, how are we thinking about succeeding with one of the most profound technology shifts in our generation, but also succeeding with the humans in the middle? And I don't mean the technical term of humans in the loop, but literally a tool for humanity. So for example, how do we design the solutions, if we're in these businesses, that truly give people superpowers? What is it that you have put into my backpack that makes me better, makes me stronger than what I was before? How do you take the toil out of work and actually bring more joy? How do you leave more time for something that the technology cannot replace, at least not yet, which is human-to-human connection and interaction? If you think about a lot of the tasks that generative AI is really good at for all of our daily lives and work, a lot of it is kind of the transaction or toil stuff. If we look at a software engineer, refactoring legacy code is probably not, if I were to poll all of you, the number one thing that you would like to get up at 9 a.m. and start working on. So how do you take that ability for the machine to be part of the team, to be part of your personal team to make you more successful, to leave more time for other types of things? How do we identify the new skills and capabilities? What does it mean to succeed in this era? We know some of the obvious ones. We know that there are new things like prompt engineering, which one of the things that I love about prompt engineering is that while it sounds like a very fancy title, the prerequisites could be even just being an English major, because ultimately prompt engineering is about asking questions. So, you know, in a room of engineers, I do say that there may be some hope for others who want to participate in this economy, in the generative AI, era. But it also changes how we think about work and skills. And so how would you change that rubric? Another question is, how do we think about equity and access in the new era of AI? Certainly the last speaker talked a lot about how do you pull in images and prevent bias. But the broader idea of how do you make sure that all communities have access to these tools if they're so powerful? If you take some of what's being discussed in the education sector, how do you provide that tutor for every child so that everyone has access to someone that gives them the extra on the education? How do we rethink whole systems and processes, not just activities? The two charts I shared with you about how do you rethink a sales rep, how do you rethink retail operations, that's just the beginning of systems thinking. How do we rethink the systems given all of these powerful technologies we now have at our disposal? And then the last question is something about, it's not just the kind of zeros and ones, but how does this unlock our creativity? And I think we're just at the very beginning of understanding and not fearing our relationship with working with machines to enhance something so essential about humanity, which is creativity. So I've left you with more questions than answers, like any good talk. It's a short talk. I want to leave some time for questions. And thank you so much for coming, especially during lunch when I'm sure many of you are hungry.
Hi there. A question. We have about 8 billion people, and we don't have a million models of AI. So it looks to me that things will become more vanilla because the same people will go to the same AI models to do that retailing, that operations, finding the same solutions and looking more and more and more the same. So how can you bring some color to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting philosophical question about whether you need many or few models. The one thing I would just say is that the models are not narrow. I mean, the expanse of information that some of the largest language models have is almost beyond what we can imagine. And so it's not necessarily the case that a large language model might not be able to take into consideration the nuances of 8 billion people. I mean, what we can see these machines doing right now is just staggering. It's nothing that I would have expected 10 years ago. And then also, I do think there is something that you do see smaller models on top or applications, and some of that will help with it's not necessarily fine-tuning, but the customization of the application for very specific communities or specific uses. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great point. So when we have been mapping as best we can where companies are, we do find that the vast majority of them are still in pilot. And in many ways, if you think kind of from a work plan perspective back, it completely makes sense. I mean, the very first thing an enterprise needs to do is make sure that if they're blending an LLM with their own company data, that's in a completely secure environment. I'm not even getting fancy on the type of AI risk that you have to, you'd have to consider, not even at hallucinations, just that that data itself is secure in the enterprise. So, I mean, it does take a couple beats for companies, especially your largest companies, to create a safe and practical environment to start building things. I do think, to your point, it does take time for all of us to change. And, and so what I think we are seeing and what I worry about is that people are disappointed already that this hasn't changed everything. But in actual fact, it's changing everything at a faster rate than I would have imagined. So I do think that it's more like decades to see that type of transformation. And I hope that people don't get too impatient in terms of their expectations and what they're experiencing in their workplaces and in their personal lives over the next, call it 2-3 years, as we start to move up the curve. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's a great question. So that was about the HR reward systems. There's two aspects of this. There's HR as a consumer of generative AI solutions and builders of solutions that make it easier for their employees. And then there is, I think, how, they are thinking about incentives, compensation, accountability. So maybe just to touch on both, I think some HR functions have been really piloting and testing, are there easier ways to get basic information to our employees? Like, I don't know if anyone's had the process of trying to get a claim. Is this covered under my corporate insurance? Do I have to go to this doctor or that doctor? I've torn my ACL. How does that process work? I mean, really basic things can be incredibly complicated in some companies, maybe none of the ones you work in, but for the ones where that's a pretty complicated process, how can generative AI streamline some of that information to make it easier? So there are things like that that you start to see deployed. And then in terms of HR, one of the things is as we see these solutions, especially when they start to hit workflow and productivity, you tend to see several key people at the table shaping this. The CEO, the chief data officer, the CIO, the head of HR, because you have to do this, and your chief risk officer or someone who's representing responsible AI, maybe your chief compliance officer. But we are finding it does take a cross-functional set of leaders to be thinking about how these things interconnect as you scale them.
To follow up on that, coming from a prompt engineering background side, we found upskilling across the workforce, one of the biggest barriers and the most prominent is the mental model. It doesn't matter for an engineer or somebody from content or from HR, the mental model is that this is either a search bar or a command bar.
Yeah.
So when you simplify prompt engineering to asking questions, I think that's a very good point because it's about the interaction. How do you recommend companies outside of just leadership demonstrate the change in perception needed to actually even begin leveraging AI for productivity?
Oh, I love your point. I mean, I probably have several thoughts, but maybe just to condense it to two. One thing is I don't think we can underestimate experiential training. And I just don't think companies can underinvest in this. So I'll give you an example. We were running training for the entire VP core of a company in anticipation that they would start to release some generative AI pilots, and they wanted to make sure the leaders, not just the CEO and the top team, felt like they understood and could be big advocates for it. We were in the middle of it was a short training, just an hour, so not even satisfactory to what you would want. And I was protesting. I was like, we need like half a day. They're like, we do not have half a day. Let's just do the hour. So we went through some exercises, and the punchline is one of the VPs, she's like, we're on Zoom. She's like, I get it. I've been doing this wrong. And so what we did was we did kind of the consumer case of planning your travel. And she was planning a summer trip for her and her family, and she realized you don't ask one question, you have a conversation. Now, that's what you were getting at. I can say this on slides in 20 different formats, busy, small font, big. I mean, I could say it a number of times. It's not actually going to make a difference till you experience it yourself and you have that aha moment. And so one of the best things about this technology, and I see you nodding, is it's so accessible. I mean, it's one of the things that I absolutely love. Anyone can be a power user, but you do need to use to be a power user. And so there's that type of education. I think there's a deeper set of skill shift that we are just scratching the surface of understanding. And for this, I hope we do a much better job, particularly in the corporate sector, than we have over the last 10 years with automation technologies.
Most conversations around this talk about enhancing people's ability to do their job.
Yeah.
And technological revolutions in the past have provided probably more jobs than they've destroyed. Is this different?
I think that in the long run, the over-under will be more jobs gained than jobs lost. And even when we track more broadly, and Ben, who's in the audience here, who was so kind to invite me here today, he knows that we do an annual report on technology trends, and we've been mapping talent. And for, even without generative AI, for all the jobs lost globally, we see actually 2% higher jobs gained in terms of technology-related jobs. So I think at the macro, at the highest level, we'll see more jobs gained. The challenge is, if you are Sam working in job X, that is like an incredibly unfulfilling answer, because in the macro, we will have more jobs gained, but the individual human experience with that transition can be incredibly bumpy, and that is an incredibly soft way of saying it. So back to the earlier question, how do we think about that? You have people who may think that the government policies need to step in. You may have people who think that companies need to invest differently. You have people who say that you have to fill the gap of the transition of jobs. You have people who say we have to rethink education. Because frankly, a college degree is not going to be the type of skills, if that college degree, like in my case, was 20 years ago, aren't going to be the type of classes and skills that are going to help me over the next 5 years keep my job and survive. And so I think we have a real tension here with the long-term outcomes, which I do believe will be quite positive, but I don't think we can at all minimize the short-term and individual challenge. And so how we lead is incredibly important right now. Maybe final question, because I think I'm going to get booted off. I see him nodding. Final question. But thank you so much for the questions. I was a little worried that no one was going to ask questions.
When it comes to training, do you have suggestions on what's the format of training that can be more effective?
Yeah, so I typically am quite a fan of longer training and continuous. Almost think of it as immersive into your job. But I do think that if you're really practical, even short training that is more usage, more experiential, is worth it. So I do think it tends to be, who you're training. But I think some experiential training is better than none. But the best training is for adult learners is you need to practice something 12 to 15 times to actually build that new muscle. And so repeated and practical training that relates to their actual everyday activities and jobs really, really matter. With that, thank you so much, and hope you enjoy your day.